colonialism is like a sharp and long blade that crosses this world. Sometimes we see the handle, other times we see the sharp end, but if we pay attention, we can see that colonialism is behind a lot of structures that exist in this world. Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of Earth wrote, "The colonial world is a world divided into compartments. Yet, if we examine closely this system of compartments, we will at least be able to reveal the lines of force it implies." We can't talk about white supremacy without talking about colonialism. They depend on each other, and in certain circumstances, they determine how the world is organized. The COVID pandemic is not the exception. During this pandemic, we have seen how colonialism and white supremacy have played a role in access to vaccines. Wealthy countries are hoarding vaccines and blocking poor countries from the global south from producing their own COVID vaccines by not allowing patent waivers while also keeping a monopoly on medical tools. And it's so funny and interesting to see how white supremacy and white saviorism work together in this situation, because they deny us agency while saying at the same time that they will help us by sending us the vaccines that they have left. For example, Canada said that they will donate the vaccines leftovers to lower income countries after hoarding vaccines and being one of the countries who had an undetermined position when deciding over whether or not to waive monopolies for COVID medical tools and patents to other countries. Another example is Sweden, who vehemently said that they will give priority to its citizens but will eventually help other countries, while voting against COVID patent waivers for the countries they want to help. This is just another example of how dehumanizing white saviorism is and how certain groups of people are valued under the colonial white supremacist gaze. Colonialism prevails even over common sense. Experts and research have shown that stockpiling vaccines in wealthier countries are prolonging this healthcare crisis. For some former colonies, it will take years before them getting their population vaccinated against COVID. Oliver Waters from the London School of Economics said that the stark reality is that the world who needs more doses of COVID-19 vaccines than any other vaccine in history in order to immunize enough people to achieve global vaccine immunity. Unless vaccines are distributed more equitably, it will be years before the coronavirus is brought under control at a global level. White saviorism is colonial violence and fake solidarity, using a crisis to either keep a power grip or enhance the country's brand as a beacon of equality. Countries like the one I come from are not asking for handouts. They are being denied agency. There's a lot of data provided by the United Nations, World Health Organization, and Doctors Without Borders explaining that racist practices and policies during the pandemic are prolonging this crisis. Colonialism and white supremacy are making certain groups more vulnerable also within the borders of so-called wealthy countries. In countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Sweden, the groups that have been affected the most by COVID have been people of color, especially black people. There's also the situation that in these countries, people of color are more likely to have jobs that can't be done from home. Now, let's talk about the specific situation in some countries, because if we talk about the situation in each country in the world, we will never end. In my beloved colonial Dominican Republic, we're doing considerably better than some countries in the region when it comes to vaccinations because we have received the Chinese vaccine Sinovac. However, the Dominican government stated back in February that they will not include Haitian and Venezuelan migrants living in the country in the national vaccination plan. The president of the Dominican Republic, Luis Abinader, explained that the government will request the World Health Organization to supply vaccines for those groups, but the thing is that no request has been made so far. And because they are not included in the national vaccination plan, it could make it harder for organizations like the World Health Organization to help. This is another example of how racism destroys good judgment and intelligence. I'm thinking about doing a series about that, to be honest, because the world is full of people who choose racism over survival. One of the difficulties the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has faced during this global crisis has been that governments were not listing refugees and other displaced people when coming up with their vaccination plans. What the Dominican government is doing can completely backfire because it affects the public health strategy to fight the pandemic, on top of being extremely cruel and racist. Within colonized countries, colonial values are ingrained in their national identity and institutions, even though a lot of those countries are officially independent. I mean, we don't need to be scientists to see how racist this policy is, and it's just another one of the many anti-Haitian policies that exist in the country. But that's something for another episode because it's really long. This pandemic hasn't also stopped our favorite colonial Canadian multinational company, Barrick Gold, from trying to destroy another Dominican community because colonial violence never takes a break. The Barrick Gold is a Canadian mining company with operations around the world, established in the Dominican Republic in 2009. Currently, they are building a tail dam at the source of the Osama River in Yamasá. A tail dam is a dam where all the chemical waste that is produced by the mineral extraction of gold is dumped. The Osama River is one of the most important rivers in the country, and the tail dam will contaminate the water supply of Yamasá and other municipalities in the area. On April 29th of 2021, the National Police and SWAT teams went to attack peaceful protesters. You might be wondering, what does this have to do with the pandemic? Because it's very transparent that they're taking advantage of the fact that everybody's attention is on the current healthcare crisis. And to contaminate communities' access to water will not only destroy these communities in the long run, well, not so long to be honest, but it could also aggravate the spread of the virus by disrupting people's access to clean water. Now let's go to the US. The Biden administration hasn't stopped having children in cages at detention centers in the US. And back in February, more than 20 babies and children were deported back to Haiti, regardless of this current administration promises of a more humane migration policy. In Stockholm, the communities who are having the lowest vaccination rates are communities with a high migrant population. A few months ago, Sweden's chief epidemiologist Anders Tegnell, I'm so tired of this dude to be honest, blamed immigrants for the spread of the virus, saying that immigrants have been a strong driver of spreading the infection, and also saying Stockholm and those other cities have big population from other countries, which is important because the spread is much bigger and quicker among those populations. Now, keep in mind that Sweden has taken a very relaxed approach to the pandemic. They barely started recommending masks in public transport during rush hour. They ignore World Health Organization recommendations. They have kept schools open and were trying to achieve herd immunity. How is this our fault? Swedish Migration Agency hasn't stopped its increasingly hostile approach and policies during the pandemic. On the contrary, it is using this healthcare crisis as an excuse to delay issuing residency permits for people who are waiting, while at the same time deporting people. We have the case of Frey and her child who will be deported back to Ethiopia after living for more than 9 years in Sweden and having a stable permanent job. Not only in the middle of a pandemic, but also in the middle of a horrible military conflict that is killing thousands and destroying the region. Sadly, her case is not the only one. The Swedish government hasn't also taken a break from destroying Sami territories during the pandemic because, as we all know, colonialism doesn't take a break. The Sami people are an indigenous group from Northern Europe native to Sapmi, which is the colonized area in the north of Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Russia. Sveaskog is a state-owned company and Sweden's largest forest owner in Sweden. They have been destroying forests in different Sami territories in what is called the north of Sweden since back in November of 2020. Well, since ever, and mining, but that's another story. Okay. This is not only a direct attack on Sami people's sovereignty, but also their survival, because Sami reindeer herders rely on those forests for their animals' survival, since these ancient forests have a special type of lichen which is a key source of food for reindeer, and without it they will die. The actions of the Swedish government against the Sami people are part of the history of colonial violence against this indigenous group. To do it in the middle of a pandemic is just adding insult to injury, and sending the police to harass protesters is just the cherry on top. Now, let's talk about our favorite white feminist, Prime Minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen. She and her government have been pushing extremely racist policies during this pandemic, like dismantling neighborhoods in Copenhagen with an immigrant majority population by evicting POC residents, especially Muslims, and deporting Syrian families back to Syria under this pandemic while there's still war in the country, because the Danish government determined that some parts of Syria, yes, Syria, are safe. Therefore, it is safe for Syrian refugees to go back to their country. Now, keep in mind that Denmark doesn't have diplomatic relations with Syria because of the war. When a country deports someone, it needs to have a deportation arrangement and diplomatic relations with the country it's deporting people to. So, what the Danish government is doing is offering Syrians who live in Denmark money to go back to Syria, or else they will be detained in their lovely migration detention centers. But the problem is that this detention could be indefinitely because, as I mentioned before, the country does not have a deportation arrangement with Syria. To praise Mette Frederiksen and claim girl power and women in leadership positions are the answer shields her from criticism and validates her government's racist policies. We people of color don't have the luxury of not thinking about policies during this pandemic because racism doesn't take a break. And racism does make us more vulnerable against COVID. So it is fair to bring up racism and colonialism when talking about COVID because they are killing people. And of course, I do understand that Mette Frederiksen, for example, has done some good job, but because a broken clock is right twice a day, it doesn't mean that we must buy it. To applaud politicians that do policies that only benefit white people is not only dangerous and cruel, but it is also a way to reinforce the colonial white supremacist system this world is in. How can we say that colonialism was so long ago when things like this still happen? To live in a colonial world as a racialized person is to live in a post-apocalyptic world. To say that some lives are less deserving than others is just part of the constant dehumanization of racialized bodies. Thank you so much for listening. I invite you to listen to my previous episode about migration and the cases of Robert Sipsoffe in Denmark and the Santos Larsson family in Sweden, which also happened during the pandemic. I also invite you to check my Instagram account where I have a post with more detailed information about the situation of the Sami people versus Sveaskogen. And in my Instagram, I also have more information about the situation of La Barrick Gold in Yamasa. And I invite you to check my previous episodes where I talk about the Barrick Gold operations in the Dominican Republic with more details. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, and share. It is thanks to you and your support that this project keeps growing. I'm also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and most podcast platforms. And of course, my official website, www.mangopodcast.com. I do have a Patreon, so check it out. And I'm also on PayPal if you would like to support but don't want to do it via Patreon. All of my links are on my official website and on my Instagram. As always, the sources and articles I use for each episode are listed in the description. Thank you once again for listening and supporting this project that I do with a lot of love and care. And this is Mango Podcast.